Hi there and welcome. My name is Elliot Williams. I'm a principal at the Raben Group, and thank you so much for joining us here today for this great panel. You know, it's almost exactly 1 year, I think, to the day that we started doing these events virtually. So here we are once again a year later. The funny thing is, a year ago when we first started these, we had a bunch of live events set for March that we'd kicked ahead to April because we just thought, of course, we'll be back in a matter of weeks. And here we are 11 and a half months later with the same message that we kicked off our very first one with. We hope everybody is safe and doing well. We are not epidemiologists here and aren't going to make claims about the end being in sight, but it looks like it is, and we hope everybody's doing well. But what a year, even setting COVID aside and setting aside the realities of the world we're in, what a year it's been. And one of the most profound experiences that America and the world shared and experienced over the course of the last year was this, I hesitate to use the word reckoning, but this confrontation of race. Reckoning is a weird word because that assumes that something was fixed or addressed, and many of the problems that plague us with respect to race are still there. And one big institution that we all live with and experience that certainly had a number of questions to ask itself and be asked by others was the media. How did the media do? Now, again, the reckoning, or whatever you want to call it, wasn't just about Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben getting canceled. There are bigger questions about who we are as a nation, but also with respect to media, who tells stories, who's a part of stories, who starts businesses, who's heard, who speaks, and so on. And we're joined by two guests today that precipitated in part by George Floyd, but even by the death of George Floyd, which we are also, my goodness, about a year removed from, but also started asking very serious questions about what the voices are that are heard in media and who deserves to be heard and who deserves to be uplifted. And so we are joined today, we're thrilled to be joined today by the leaders, the founders of URL Media. That's Mitra, Kalita, who's a former executive at CNN, and Sarah Lomax-Reese, who's a president and CEO of WURD Radio, the only African-American owned talk radio station in Pennsylvania. So thank you both for being here. It's wonderful to see you and have you for this important conversation we're going to have today.
Thank you, Elliot.
Thanks.
Of course. So big picture, before we start talking about you and your work and the things you do and so on. And this is, let me start with you, Mitra, and Sarah, you can jump in too. But this is so big picture, macro. What is the point of journalism? Like,
oh God.
No, I'm serious though. Because we're going to get into what that means for all of us. But what are we here for, right?
It's a really good question, and it's a good way to begin, actually, even though it could take us days to answer that. So I've been thinking about this literally as recently as like half an hour ago, because I'm in the middle of a project helping people get registered for vaccines. And I happened to be challenged yesterday on, is that journalism? Because URL, of course, is a journalism outlet. Epicenter, the newsletter that I run within as a member of this network, which we can talk about and sort of how we're structured later, is a journalism operation. And why are we registering people for vaccines? That's not journalism. And I would argue that service to our communities is journalism, that the failure of government to have messages and services reach the people and filling gaps has historically been the role of journalism, that accountability, which journalism as the fourth estate is supposed to uphold in democracy, right? What we're doing right now on the ground is very much connecting news and information to the people who need it most. So I would say the service piece of it, though, is what I cling to in my definition, and is ever slightly different from my 21 years in mainstream media, where journalism with a capital J was very much defined by what you were delivering to people in terms of an article, a video. It was defined by an object as opposed to a purpose.
Because I've known you for a while, I can say I am impressed that your journalism career is now old enough to drink legally, which
and it does, Elliot, as you
I don't.
know.
I don't doubt it for a second, Sarah. Because this is an important, big, thinky question. Do you have a similar answer, different answer as to what's the point of it all?
Yeah, I think I have a different answer, but maybe along the same vein. I've been a Black media entrepreneur for my entire career. Before we got on, we realized that we have a similar educational background, Penn and Columbia, J School. But my whole professional career has been as an independent media owner operator in serving the Black community. So I published an African American health magazine for 10 years, and I've been running this Black talk station for 10 years. There's a lot of conversation in the journalism, capital J world about trust right now, and about what is real journalism and what is the role. And so I always go back to the roots of Black media. 1827, when Freedom's Journal, the first Black newspaper, was started. Black people have never had the luxury of kind of splicing and taking kind of this really lofty position about journalism. We created media outlets and we created journalism to advocate for our very humanity, for the fact that in 1827, Black people were property, Black people were chattel, Black people were not people, considered Black, were not considered people. And so, that was the origins of the need for journalism in the African American tradition. And I feel like I am a part of that very long legacy of really advocating for the full humanity of Black people. Even now, we talk about George Floyd, we talk about all of the examples of Black people being treated in very inhumane and subhuman ways. And I believe that a very important part of my work with WURD and our work with URL Media is around speaking into and advocating and demonstrating, illustrating the full humanity of Black and brown people, because we don't see that reflected in mainstream media often enough. And yeah.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about what URL is, because it's not Uniform Resource Locator, as we know the acronym to be. But tell us exactly what the organization that you both founded exists to do, and then we can talk about why you founded it and so on, and how it came to be. But most importantly, what is it? Like, what's the widget?
So I'll start with the L because it was inspired by Sarah. So Sarah and I, in the post-death of George Floyd, were on a panel together when Sarah talked about the need to love our people. And in all my years in journalism, I had never, we talk about user-centric journalism, we talk about serving the audience, we talk about engaging the audience, all the buzzwords, right? But I had never thought about loving our people. And in that moment, I thought, if I ever launch a media outlet, I would love to launch something that loves my child the same as your child, Elliot, and the same as your child, Sarah. And I really thought about this idea of loving your people and your audience and what the difference there could be. Sarah, you want to take the U and the R?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So U and R stands for uplift, respect, and love. So URL stands for uplift, respect, and love. And the idea from a business standpoint, it's a very beautiful sentiment for sure, and we believe and we stand behind it. But the business model is really creating a network of what we call high-performing Black and brown owned media organizations that are doing the work, that are serving communities authentically, are creating, powerful, consistent content, and are doing really great journalism. And so right now we launched with 8 media organizations that are owned by Black and brown people. Word, my radio station, and Epicenter are two of those 8 stations. But we have, we have an incredible diversity, South Asian and immigrant and Haitian and Latino. And so the premise is that we are all serving these communities really well, but because we are independent, because we are, often resource challenged individually, we believe that we can be stronger together. And so it's not like we're acquiring these media outlets. Each media outlet is independent, but we are creating a way to share content, amplify our great content, but also share revenues, because we believe and I know as a Black media entrepreneur for my entire career that access to capital and revenue growth and streams are part of what keep us limited in terms of our ability to experiment and grow and innovate. And so we believe that URL, through this aggregated model, has the potential to amplify and expand revenues that will then in turn allow our outlets to be leaders instead of, kind of it perpetually struggling. And so that's kind of the basis for URL.
And something that struck me, and one of the things I read about you is that it was important to you in the founding of the organization that it be a for-profit organization, right? Talk about that and about sort of the idea of wealth creation through media and why that's important, or was an important aspect of your founding.
Go ahead, Mitra.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is important to both of us. So Sarah and I, I would say we both, there's 2 ways I look at it when I think about why Sarah and I get along so well. One, we both grew up in homes that were very generous and inclusive in, Elliot, you and I have talked about this, but I had lots of people in my basement, lots of food on the table, lots of people dropping by. It was like a classic immigrant household, right? Uh-huh. And the belief was that you share information, you share what you got, because that helps everybody, right? And I think that's an important distinction from how a lot of collaborations and partnerships, start out, end up working. The second piece is just the importance of uplifting our people in all senses of that word. And so while we are we have some nonprofits in our partnerships, we certainly have relied on philanthropy for us to get to even this stage of URL's launch. Mm-hmm. We also believe mightily in the power of our people as a market, right? And so advertising and the ability to sell this market and sell that advertising is very important. The ability to uplift from a not just framing coverage as charitable, right? And not just saying, look, Black and brown causes and Black and brown issues are going to be about, say, affordable housing, right. Criminal justice. Like there's sort of a framework that nonprofits operate within. And I'm like, look, there's also a lot of our people that are wildly successful, right? We want to be able to share that story. We want to be able to cover Beyonce. We want to be able to say, hey, like, what's the lens on the Oscars according to our perspective, right? And I think that the for-profit actually gives us more flexibility on that front. Sarah, did I miss anything on that?
Well, I mean, I will just add to it. I mean, for me, like Mitra and I were very clear that we wanted this to be for profit, and a big part for me around it being for profit is this issue of wealth creation and the fact that there is a lack thereof. There's a lack of generational wealth in the Black community in particular. A lot of times every generation is starting from like zero. And I have seen in my own life, my father was very successful. He was wildly successful he was a physician, but he was also this incredibly successful entrepreneur. And I personally saw the power of what a generous person, a generous man can do with his wealth. He was able to support, Black cultural organizations in Philadelphia, whether it was theater or dance or the museum or whatever. He was, and a lot of times he stood in the gap between them being able to make their payroll and them not being able to make their payroll. So I saw firsthand what the power of wealth, like in the Black community, because we don't have a lot of concentrated wealth, most of our institutions are perpetually struggling. They're perpetually on their heels. And if we as Black people don't support those institutions, chances are they're not going to get the level of support that they can. So if we can aggregate wealth within the Black community, there's a better chance that the entire community has the potential of benefiting. So I believe that media has the potential for being a wealth creator, not just for us as owner,
right,
but for all of our partners. That the core model for URL is to financially empower the partners, the cohort in the URL network. It's not just about, and by extension, that hopefully creates creates more balanced approaches to wealth access in Black and Brown communities.
So before moving back to another macro, bigger question about issues in facing media and so on, this is the personal anecdote portion of this, and I'd be curious to hear. Look, we're talking to two wildly successful Black and Brown women about your lives in media. Was there a eureka moment for either of you where you said, over the course of your Mitra, your 21 years or whatever, where you just said, this is not right. This personally is not right. And it's time to change or get out or whatever it might be. Like, can you cite to one or point to a moment where just sort of a switch flipped off in your head?
I mean, I do think post George Floyd, I was in a state, and I turned to Sarah often in those days, right? So I think we also had a personal connection. I worked at CNN for the last 5 years, and there was suddenly a great interest. And you would think that as someone who's worked on diversity, equity, and inclusion my entire career, that would have been a moment, right? A moment of opportunity, or, oh, finally everybody around me is getting it. And rather than seize it, at least in those early days, I really felt myself retreating. And I retreated for a few reasons that might sound familiar, especially to the folks of color, or especially those who've been advocating for these issues for quite some time. One was, it just felt like, is this legitimate, right? Is this a fad? Is this legitimate? We've kind of been through different phases or versions of this before. And there was a part of me that didn't want to get too hopeful. There was another part of me that really, I guess the aha moment for me was in the sense of mission of a company. And if so many of our institutions in the United States, from Washington itself to media to big companies, came of age, from a time, as Sarah articulated, when Black people were not even considered human. How does that color the lens of how they do business and operate? And so I had this moment of feeling like, this is only going to work if we start over. It really is, to your point about the reckoning, right? And so that was sort of the moment where I said, I don't think I can work within mainstream institutions. I can work with them. I definitely think our model is rooted in working with them. But I really want to try something that centers Black voices. And we serve Black and Brown audiences, but Sarah and I have been very clear that if you center Black America, everybody else benefits, right? And so I felt like, Sarah, I don't know if you want to pick up here on the kind of phone calls that we had around that time period and how this was born, but that was my moment of saying, nothing short of doing this anew and doing this big, right? This is a big problem, but it needs a big solution, is going to work.
This is why we're business partners. Okay, because I'm like super clear that, like, I don't know if we could be in this struggle together if Mitra didn't have that perspective that she just shared, that if you center the Black struggle, then, if we figure out systemic racism and anti-Black racism and white supremacy as it pertains to Black Americans, we will solve a lot for all people of color. We will figure a lot out, and everyone, not just people of color, but everyone will benefit if we can put a dent in anti-Black racism, because it really is, it's a drug and it is an infectious disease. And all of us are impacted by it. So, but for me, my aha moment is just my entire career. The aha moment is I never, ever, ever thought that I would see a day when my Black focused media career would have legs beyond me wanting to do right by my people. I never thought that there might actually be a business model associated with it, because June 2020, with the protests and the global protests, people did not necessarily support the work that I've committed myself to for decades. It was kind of, you have some people who, like hooked you up, or, there was some value, but the line always moves when it comes to Black people. In the 90s, it was, we're really going with multicultural. We don't really want to deal with just, in the 70s, it was I'm Black and I'm proud, and coming out of the 60s. But once you got to the 80s, all of that stuff's kind of like shifted. And then the 90s, and and so this is a new day. It's a new era. It's a new moment, unlike anyone that I've ever experienced in my lifetime and my career, where we are actually talking about reparations. We're talking about anti-Black racism. We're talking about white supremacy. We're talking about what corporate America needs to do to, address the decades and centuries of disinvestment in Black communities and in Black media and all of those things. This is so I guess my aha moment is just, I'm still in the aha, because I'm shocked that there is an appetite for rectifying something that's been a problem for a very, very, very long time. And I too am skeptical. And I think that what Mitra and I are determined to do with URL and all the things that we do is, keep the pedal to the metal to make sure that this is not, America has proven that they get they lose a lot of energy around this stuff very quickly. It's a very fickle country, and people get distracted and bored with these issues a lot. And so it's our responsibility to kind of keep it front and center.
Sarah, let me stay with you for just one quick second on this whole concept of business model, right? And there's two approaches, or there's many approaches, but I think we've sort of touched around two different approaches here. Diversifying existing white-owned media and building almost like as a parallel or outside institutions of Black or brown-owned media. Like, what are the pitfalls to attempting to just work in the existing system and try to diversify it and make it whatever, more conscious or woke or whatever adjective you wish to use, or just stepping outside and creating something new? I'm sure you've probably confronted this throughout your career, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. So I definitely believe it's a both end strategy. I don't think you need conscious, woke people everywhere. And so I'm definitely not one of those people who's like there's only one way to, because this problem is, and this it's just massive. And so we need good, conscious people everywhere. But what the history shows us, 1968, the Kerner Commission report to the media as a major contributor to the separate and unequal American society and the oppression and subjugation of Black people. You know, a governmental body like did the work, and they revealed that you know, the fact that the media was so white and non-diverse, it really was objectifying and stereotyping and contributing to the racial divisions in the country. So you fast forward 53 years now, 2021, and we know that newsrooms are still not diverse. They still have not solved, after all those years, the problems that exist in mainstream media around diversity, equity, and inclusion are chronic and recurring and have not been addressed. So what that leads me to is that you must have empowered, independent, Black-owned, Brown-owned media organizations that are whole and healthy and vibrant, not just these like, you know, under-resourced, underfunded, you know, barely hanging on life support, which is what typically happens in America, because all the resources go to the big organizations. And so we're trying to disrupt that with URL. We're trying to say, you know what, we can be small and mighty. We can lean into all the assets and the benefits of being small by aggregating our strength, you know, across multiple media properties.
Question for you, Mitra. We talk about mainstream media. There's TV, there's newspapers, and all of that. But there's what I think is a growing world of newsletters. And obviously, you've been behind at least one in your life. Tell me about diversity there. Like, sort of, what's the deal with newsletters? Like, I know, and forgive my ignorance here, but I know there's also a like Substack and journalists breaking off of traditional sources, but those tend to be more white as well. So just talk through that a little bit.
That's a great question. So I'll talk about it kind of at the top level, like as to what's happening in media, and then I can bring it back to URL. At the top line, the Substack movement has been super fascinating, right? Kind of well-known journalist leaves the outlet, launches a Substack, charges people $5, $50 a month, whatever. Suddenly he's making, six figures, 600K. Like, those are the stories you hear about. There's an inversion of the most profitable folks on Substack, mostly white men, and the most popular folks on Substack. That's when you start to get, and they're free, that's when you start to get a lot more diversity, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's just really an important, as we talk about inclusion and strategies, I think newsletters, especially those that are on a membership model that are, gated by, you pay for it and you get access to this information. I think that's clearly affecting diversity in terms of audience. As a strategy, I think this idea of going micro is what newsletters really feed. Email, of course, is ubiquitous, except where it's not. And so you have, in the United States at least, like email newsletters really taking off. In India, not so much, right? India, in fact, one of our partners is ScrollStack, really leans into WhatsApp, really leans into social platforms like Twitter and Facebook, and kind of distribution on social, as opposed to the more gated email, have to be logged in to get that. How does this relate to URL? So I actually really do think that digital innovation and diversity have everything to do with each other. So while we are really blessed by having many ethnic groups in our current group of 8, we also are so lucky that we have Sarah's Station, which is radio. We have TBN 24, which is live stream. We have me in newsletters. We have the Houston Times, which started as a newspaper and now has a thriving website and a membership model. And so the ability to disrupt.
Come on. Like,
that's the Haitian.
Like, have you not done a Zoom before in your life?
That happens.
Basic 101 to just click.
Sorry, I don't know how that happens. That happens every so often. I don't know how to turn it off. I'm sorry.
I mean,
it won't happen, Elliot.
All right.
So I am bullish on newsletters as long as you understand that that's not all you can be, right? That you see this as one way of reaching a certain audience, and that you are paying attention to, what is the service, utility, all the other things we've talked about that I'm offering end users. And then the last thing I'll say is the nicheification that they represent, which is what Substack represents, is really interesting. We at URL have tended not to be as obsessed around personal brands, right? Like, oh, that guy is amazing, as we are among communities. This is the community we're serving with this platform in this location, in this intersectional way.
Mm-hmm. And just a reminder for folks who are listening, we are watching. I'm used to Sarah in radio, so it's not just listening. But folks who are watching, we're going to have an opportunity for questions later on in the broadcast. So by all means, type them in. We will get them asked of these two wonderful minds. So back to this question of the quote unquote reckoning, and I'm just going to call it that, not owning or buying whether it was. But let's really talk about what the media sort of got right and got wrong, or frankly, the country. It's not just the media. But to what extent do you all think the corrective measures that were put in place? Now, I sort of made a reference to Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben, but that's an avatar for the bigger problem. Like, to what extent were these measures just performative and not real measures that were put in place to really fix media?
Yeah, I mean, that's been kind of my my deepest fear, my deepest concern is that the responses were more performative, were more reactionary, as opposed to deep and substantive. And to me, I, as somebody who's been in this work and been doing kind of social justice, racial justice journalism for a very long time, what startled me and what concerned me was that all of a sudden you had big white media organizations step in front of, step out there and proclaim things very loudly and do these gestures, which you want everyone to acknowledge the harm and the wrong and all of that. But what I saw happening is they stepped out in front of people who have been doing the work all along and became the repository for funding and for resources that, in my view, should have gone to organizations that had been in the trenches and had been doing it before it was popular, or like there was a big spotlight on it. And so, I saw that with a couple. I'm not going to name names. Mitra knows who I'm talking about. But there's one organization in particular that did that, and it just boiled my blood, because I don't think a lot of corporations are discerning enough to understand where, if they're going to commit $1 billion to racial justice, it should not necessarily go to organizations that just popped up 5 minutes ago, because now there's money behind it. And so, and I see that happening, and that's very concerning, because there are organizations that have been doing this work for decades and decades and have been starved, really have been punished, in fact, for doing that work. And so, that's probably the thing that made me most concerned about this situation.
And frankly, and Mitra knows, because we've talked about this very point. I wrote a piece on it for CNN last year. My great point of cynicism is that when it became cost effective for organizations in any industry, media being one of them, but when it became cost effective to take on racism, it happened. The Washington Redskins are the best example of that. Or pardon me, the Washington football team is the best example of that, which is when they were going to lose their advertisers, they changed their name. And that's the simple fact. The NFL, when it became a question of advertisers wishing to pull their ads, the NFL suddenly changed its course on people kneeling before games. And I think, perhaps you saw some of that in media as well, but it all comes down to money, I think, right? And
it also shows, it shows so vividly that when there is a will, things change like that. People have been talking about reparations. People have been talking about a lot of the economic disparities, the wealth inequities, all of that stuff for a very long time. And it was like, you were talking to a blank wall. Black people were just crazy that, the redlining, all of the things that are in every book that show why there's all of these racial disparities. But when we saw, like, in real time, when corporations wanted to apply resources to address an unfair situation, they could do it. If they have the will, this country can change dramatically when that is prioritized. And that to me was both encouraging, but also like, damn, like, really?
So before we take a question or two, one more, this Mitra, why don't you field this one? Tell me, what about, we hear a lot about local news and the plight of local news in America as a function of consolidation of media, right? That local news is shrinking, local media outlets are vanishing by the day. To what extent does this have a disproportionate impact, like everything in American life, but disproportionate impact, on Black, brown, of color journalists, but also independent outlets of color, let's call them that?
Yeah, sure. So I'd say the basic answer is definitely has an effect because of just less coverage of, say, some of the services we talked about earlier. On the other hand, so much of our model is rooted and it rests on this belief of high-performing Black and brown entities that have filled the void for local news, or possibly local news as we kind of nostalgically talk about it in mainstream media, was never serving Black and brown people, right? Because we covered City Hall, we covered institutions. And so the institutions, of course, kind of help each other. And Black and brown people have always been on the outside looking in of those same institutions. So I think one of the opportunities, and just one of the great things that, just in the last few weeks of really examining the content of our 8 partners, is that we're super focused, right? We are focused on who our people are. We have geography in many cases. In Sarah's case, it's, Black Philadelphians, right? It's layered. And yet, there's such a global view of each outlet that I think local news really could stand to learn from, because unfortunately we've covered local news in a very bordered kind of building by building way. And you've seen these pieces, like, the New York Press used to have 12 reporters at the Queens Courthouse. And it's like, you know what? You can get the Queens Courthouse records online right now. So do we need those 12 reporters there? And so I think one way to think about local news, and we really do lean into this, is what are the communities that are organizing themselves beyond just geography, right? And who's defining local? I mean, just an anecdote I'll give you is that we tapped into the URL network for our vaccine registration efforts, right? Now, WURD had a woman who I think, I'm just going to say it here, deserves like the MacArthur Genius Prize and the Nobel Prize, Dr. Alice Stanford, who's head of the Black Doctors Consortium. She goes on WURD to talk about what it will take for Black people to get vaccinated in her 24-hour clinics. I mean, she's like a hero. I hear what she says is needed to get people trust. And it's not Joe Biden taking his vaccine on air. It's people we know, like, sort of our community. And so that becomes kind of how our registration efforts, and Elliot, a shout out to the Jamaicans here, but we got a set of Jamaican cousins. And
everybody's got a set of Jamaican cousins. I've got like 90 of them. Yeah,
from Eastern Queens. And within a few days, we had her whole church getting registered. Why? Because they heard about this. So I sent a note to TBN24 and the Haitian Times, and I said, listen, guys, we're doing these efforts as part of the URL network. Could you share with your viewers, users? You don't have to do anything. Literally, I kid you not, TBN24, 2.3 million users on Facebook, puts it on, mentions it. In a matter of seconds, my spreadsheets start populating with Bangladeshi taxi drivers, right? In Queens, right? So I need a global network in order for people to know that a local outlet like I exist. And I don't think that's the strategy, with all due respect to the folks saving local news, that they're thinking about the world in that way. And I think we could afford to be a little more expansive.
Wonderful. Love it. Okay, let's take some questions from our studio audience. So first up, we've got one. Thanks for this. Have you seen any resistance or hesitancy from outlets run by people of color in joining URL? Okay. What have the biggest challenges been in creating URL? Sarah, with your angelic, heavenly nimbus coming in.
I know.
God is a Black woman, clearly, and she is shining down upon you here.
The sun is like setting in my window, so sorry. I've been trying to adjust my camera, but anyway, I'll take it. I'll take the angelic look. So it's quite the opposite of reluctance or hesitancy or resistance to joining the URL network. We have people who are, writing to us on a daily basis asking if they can join the URL network. We are, we're just getting out of the gate, and we are committed to figuring out with our first inaugural 8 partner organizations. And so we are kind of not turning people away, but we're saying, like, just hold on. We're still figuring some things out, and when we're ready to kind of open for the next kind of, the next wave, we'll bring in and we'll evaluate the next wave. But we don't have people who are reluctant. People are like, wow, I like what you guys are doing, and we need it too, like the other outlets. And just one other thing is that, we are owner operators, Mitra and I, and we're a part of the network. And so we're trying to solve problems for our own, for WURD and Epicenter as a part of URL. So we're trying to identify the gaps that exist in our organizations so that we can provide those kinds of services that other organizations need. And that's proving to be very valuable to not just to us, but to other organizations.
Excellent. So we got another one. So with the constant racial and social and racial injustices that we see every day, what challenges do you anticipate that URL will face in getting out pivotal racial justice messages that often go overlooked? Mitra, what do you think there?
So this is fundamental to why I wanted to co-found this company. I was trained in my first job out of college before I went to Columbia with you, Elliot, was at the Associated Press. And our system of journalism was to look at the police reports that came in overnight, and we would pick what we were going to write about. And we pretty much took the police word for, in fact, if someone called us at the AP and said, I have a problem, we would say, have you filed a police report, right? That is sort of how journalism works. That's how I was trained.
Right.
And really for the last few years, and CNN is having active conversations about this, but in the places I've worked, I've tried to make this a conversation of, listen, the police record is being questioned very publicly. And it's not because of mobile phones. It's just that mobile phones are telling us that everything we thought before was actually wrong, right? And so yeah. I think the fundamentals of what Brian is asking is actually that we need to rethink the whole way that we gather news.
Wow.
And that's huge, right? So when I said this is a big problem we're trying to solve, think about how aggregation on the internet works, right? We take the official account, right? And as a lawyer, this better than anyone. Like, that record is pretty sacred, but also sets the narrative. It sets the narrative of what's to come. And this has implications not just for coverage of criminal justice, but, mistrust in the media. The first account of something always goes more viral than the correction of what actually happened.
Right.
And so for us, it's this lofty question that with our partners, I feel confident we'll solve for. It might take some time, but what should coverage of racial justice and criminal justice look like? What does it mean to have a full account? And how do you demand? I mean, you're seeing, actually, I think we're in a really great time for this, because you're seeing the public also say, hey, listen, you guys are screwing my chances of getting a job. I have a report out there on Google, it's faulty. Like, that is actually a real thing right now of people seizing their own control. I actually would argue the media is behind that need to catch up to a more full, accurate account.
2 points on the law, because I can't resist myself, because after going to school with you, I did not become a journalist. I was a lawyer for many, many years. But 2 things that are very important about that very point you made. Number one, sort of baked into the law is the notion that police testimony is inherently more credible than other eyewitness testimony. And it's not just me saying that I believe police more than anybody. No, there's case law on this, that the opinions of police as to their accounting of crime scenes are inherently given a degree of credibility unless there's a reason to disprove them. So written into our law is the notion as a country that we automatically trust the words of police, and that definitely has affected certainly how criminal justice jurisprudence has developed over the last 100 years, but also, as you've said, Mitra, how reporters think about criminal activity or how criminal activity is reported. So and racial activity as a sort of flowing from that. Another thing is that I can only imagine how cell phones, like you'd said, have changed. Certainly Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper in Central Park, and obviously George Floyd, were national stories on account of cell phones from almost independent activist journalists and citizens who decided to share something. And it's an act of journalism, even if it's merely trying to get the killer Instagram video, right?
I would just add one thing about the racial and social justice reporting question. I think that to me, it's not just about like the George Floyds and the Breonna Taylors. It's also about public education. It's also about the school to prison pipeline. It's about institutions within American society that are inherently unfair and unjust along racial lines. And to me, looking at economic inequities as a racial justice issue is very much a part of that same thing, that old journalism thing, follow the money. Because when you look at the disparities in funding of public education, of healthcare inequities, all of these things have a financial component and are connected with racial justice.
Great. So we have one more question before the big stunning peroration and fancy finish for this event. But we have from Elizabeth: what role does community-specific media play? Oh, yes, in combating misinformation in the current media landscape. It's big, and it's something that I'm certain plagues both of you and keeps you up at night. So so tell us about that, community-specific media. Mitra, what do you think?
So I think the trust issue is almost baked into all of our models, right? When you say look at our name, Uplift, Respect, and Love, right? So there's a piece of it which is immediately the outreaches, we're in it for you, and our members are certainly coming at it from the same approach. One concern I have with kind of the misinformation and mistrust narrative is that it makes the right wing seem like the problem. So it's like something over there is the problem, and we are all good, right? The public should trust us. If it just wasn't for Breitbart and Ben Shapiro, like we would be in a much better society. And while it's a little bit true, there's also mistrust. We really focus on mistrust on the right. The mistrust on, I wouldn't even say the left, because I hate when we characterize kind of people of color as just left. And the demographics of voting certainly bear that out. But there's massive mistrust among our communities of mainstream media because they're not represented, because they're ignored in terms of coverage. And, there's truth about stereotypes in coverage that kind of surface over and over again. So that leads to community media really filling this gap, as Elizabeth's asking about, where the trust is, I don't want to say inherent because that takes it for granted, but it's been earned, right? It's been earned by the types of stories that are focused on, by this idea of service. And then, one other thing I would just say is that, I think many folks in the mainstream media will think just because we write about, Black and brown people, we might be able to earn their trust. Like there's kind of this like, check the box mindset of like, let's just get them covered and then they'll come to us. And the process of building trust, not just for media, but for any brand, is in some companies' cases decades long, right? So I don't know that we can undo that damage as quickly as just checking a few boxes. And really, like, this is again why we were founded, is like getting to the mission of why you exist and who you're there to serve.
Okay, I'm going to ask that we're going to pretend this is a high school yearbook for the final question. And I'm going to ask you, where do you see yourself in 5 years? It's a two-part question, though. It's one, URL media as an institution in 5 years. What do you want it to be? But also beyond that, the state of race in journalism, right? And where do you see the world 5 years from now? It's either aspirational or realistic, however you want to answer it. Sarah, how about you first?
Yeah, well, 5 years is like not very long.
All right, 10 years, fine. All right, well, just down the road, whatever.
Well, I mean, I think that I'm, in terms of URL, you know, we're hoping in 5 or 10 years that we are a global force. You know, that this is we have media organizations owned and led by Black and brown people from all over the world, and we're able to share content, share revenues, and really, like, to me, it comes back to kind of like disruption of kind of the status quo from a capitalistic standpoint, but trying to upend capitalism so that it begins to benefit the people who have been oppressed by it. And so, you know, like I would love for URL to play a role in creating a business model that actually makes the media owners within this network, you know, successful and wealthy and able to empower their respective communities in really meaningful and profound ways. So, I mean, it's very lofty, but you know, that to me is worth the effort.
Okay, Mitra.
So, I envision us being kind of remarked upon as that was such an obvious idea. And look at how it worked, right? That a bunch of good guys, gals, and other people got together, combined forces and efforts, and they were able not to beat Goliath, because I don't think we're trying to take anyone down.
Right.
But we were able to hold our own, right? And again, like, there's something very obvious about this, because when I talk about the way we were raised as guiding this, you know, that's like the obvious piece to me. Of course, we would do business in this way. We would do business if you want inclusivity in your business, why wouldn't you operate from a place of inclusivity in how you do business, right? And so that part to me is kind of the magic of working with us. I hope that our we have ideas for syndication. We have ideas for advertising and sponsorship. I would hope that they feel the same mutual uplift, respect, and love of their brands as we are giving our own vendors. And the last thing I'll say is that we get to a stage where you can't afford to not do business with us, right? That we represent 80% of the world, right? Black and brown people, by the way, are already Goliath, right? We just haven't had the opportunity to do business in that manner. And so how do we essentially unharness that and make it impossible to not be a part of this is really what I not just dream of, but what we're trying to execute against.
Okay, Goliath the Philistine, thank you so much for all of that and that beautiful, wonderful insight. And, you know, we should check in a couple of years and see not just how you are doing as a private institution, but just the state of media and whether the lessons learned from George Floyd, I keep saying from, you know what I mean, but from last year and the Great Awakening, if you want to call it that, really have an impact on how the telling of stories works in America. But Sarah, Lomax-Reese, Mitra, Kalita, founders of URL Media, thanks for this conversation about where media are going when it comes to uplifting voices. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for inviting us, Elliot. I appreciate it.
No problem. And so yeah, this was a great conversation, and we'll be back at it consistently, just like we've been for the last year. Starting in next week, we'll have Sheldon Whitehouse here talking about federal courts. We have a continuing series of events, and we ask everybody to keep tuning in and joining us. And you can follow us on the Raben Group's YouTube page, where this event will live on for the next 5 years when we're checking in on URL Media. So thanks again, everybody, for tuning in, and stay safe, and we will see you next time.